As the 2024 campaign neared its end, candidate Donald Trump began promising that, if elected, he would support the elimination of income taxes. Shortly after he was sworn in, Trump then began saying he planned to abolish the Internal Revenue Service. The Trump team claimed in each case that it could raise enough tax revenue from tariffs to replace tax revenue from income taxes. By March, however, Trump began backtracking, and his administration announced that the new goal was to eliminate income taxes for people making under $150,000 per year. That last development on its own tells us that the IRS isn't going away. If people making more than $150,000 are still going to pay income tax, then there will need to be an IRS to which we'll need to send tax returns to prove we're not making more than $150,000. But even if we ignore that problem, there are at least two other reasons why we can be sure that the IRS isn't going anywhere. The first way we know this is from the fact that the Trump administration is only talking about abolishing the progressive individual income tax. Administration mouthpieces have said nothing at all about getting rid of the income taxes known as the payroll tax that every wage earner pays. The second way we know that the IRS isn't going away is that taxes on imports, i.e. tariffs, simply aren't going to bring in enough revenue to keep funding all the popular spending programs that Trump clearly has no interest in cutting. Now, when politicians talk about the income tax, they virtually always mean the progressive individual income tax. This tax is paid mostly by the top 50% of earners. The bottom 50% of earners pay an average income tax rate of 3.3%. They're just not generating a large share of that revenue. But there is another income tax paid by all wage earners, regardless of income level, and that is the payroll tax. If you're in the bottom 50% of earners, you're probably paying much more in payroll tax than in the individual income tax. And there is a reason why politicians never mention this income tax. It is connected to the very popular welfare programs known as Social Security and Medicare. The Social Security tax in 2025 is 12.4%. The Medicare tax is an additional 2.9% on top of that. Half of this is paid by the employees and half by the employer. Now, of course, the employee really pays for both halves because employers effectively have to reduce wages to cover the payroll tax. The money collected from these taxes goes into the general fund and not into any sort of trust fund. That means it's simply an income tax that's used to beef up federal revenues. It is true enough, though, that without this tax, it would be much harder for the federal government to collect enough revenue to keep Social Security and Medicare funded at its present levels. The feds need today's workers to keep slaving away and paying the payroll tax so it can be handed over to today's pensioners. This is why politicians never talk about getting rid of it. It would be political poison to suggest that one of the biggest sources of revenue for old age welfare programs is going away. If politicians did this, AARP-type activists would go nuts. So politicians aren't likely to get rid of the payroll tax, and that means there needs to be a government agency to keep track of everyone's wages and make sure that the tax gets collected. Now, which agency is that? Well, since 1937, it has been the Internal Revenue Service. As the IRS's history page reads, on August 14th, 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. Employees originally paid 1% of the first $3,000 of their salaries to finance the benefit. The law required a new system of tax withholding, which the Bureau of Internal Revenue had to collect. If you're going to have payroll taxes, you're going to have the IRS or something like it. Now, by the way, my readers will probably not be shocked to learn that the payroll taxes increased a lot over time. Like so many taxes, it started out, quote unquote, small, and then it got a lot larger. In 1937, when it was introduced, the payroll tax was 2%. Now it is, of course, 12.4% plus that additional 2.9%. So any payroll tax of any kind is going to require this agency, and that's the IRS. Now, it's entirely possible that Trump might rename the IRS to something like the Department of Making America Great Again. But whatever we might call it, it will just be some form of the IRS. So until Trump and his spokespeople start talking explicitly about abolishing all taxes on income, and not just the progressive income tax, then we know he isn't serious about getting rid of the IRS. Now, the second reason why the Trump administration is not really going to get rid of all income taxes or the IRS is this. tariffs won't bring in enough revenue to keep up with the federal government's big spending plans. As of 2024, customs duties, that is tariffs, made up 2% of all federal revenues. That includes the new tariffs put in place by Trump and kept in place by Biden in recent years. The total revenue is only $80 billion. Now, while that's 2% of all revenue, it's only 1.2% of all federal spending. Remember that federal spending is far larger than federal revenue, and the federal government will likely run a deficit of at least $2 trillion this year alone. In other words, the $80 billion connected from tariffs is a drop in the bucket. And in contrast, the progressive individual income tax brings in about 49% of all federal tax revenue. And in addition to that, the payroll tax brings in 35% of all of that. So if Trump thinks he's going to replace all income tax with tariff revenues, then he'll need to increase tariff revenue from $80 billion to about $4.1 trillion. Now, remember, a trillion is 1,000 billion. So that is, Trump will have to find a way to increase tariff revenues by 51-fold. Now, that would just cover current revenue. If we want tariffs to actually eliminate the deficit, which is roughly $2 trillion more than tax revenue, tariff revenue will have to go up even more. People who think this seems plausible might say things, well, Trump will get rid of the deficit and cut federal spending using DOGE. People who say things like this are basically also saying, I am bad at arithmetic. Currently, the best case scenario offered by DOGE is that it wants to cut a mere $1 trillion in federal spending. This is almost certainly complete fantasy, but for the sake of argument, let's assume DOGE is able to do that. This wouldn't even eliminate the deficit overall, and the remaining deficit would still be more than $1 trillion. That would mean that next year's total for federal spending would still be about $5.7 trillion. To close the gap between revenues and spending, tariff revenues would need to increase by at least another trillion on top of the other trillions necessary to replace income taxes. That means federal tax collectors will have to increase its current tariff revenue 60 times over. So can Trump just increase tariff rates by 60-fold? Some protectionists might love that, but it would also mean that people would stop buying imported goods at such high prices. And that also means they'll stop paying the tariffs then, and tax revenue will then plummet. So, and in addition to that, so would the standard of living, because producers would have no access to all these foreign goods that are used in producing things in America, and of course, those producers also employ people. So even as revenues fell, though, most Americans would continue to demand all the usual spending. We know this from survey data, which shows that federal spending is very popular. Yes, people complain about taxes, but when asked which federal programs are you going to cut, there is really no appetite for that. Now, given this fact, politicians wouldn't dare cut military spending or Social Security spending, and federal deficits would skyrocket. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, would then have to start buying up treasuries to keep interest rates from running sky high as more and more treasuries were dumped into the market to finance these huge deficits because the tariffs aren't bringing in enough revenue. And so this would mean more money printing and high levels of inflation, because that's what would result from the Fed having to force down interest rates in the face of huge deficits. Now, America's federal politicians aren't willing to risk any of that. Again, they won't even talk about getting rid of the payroll tax because that brings up the issue of Social Security. Politicians want to keep spending at current levels, and politicians know that price inflation is very unpopular with the voters, so they don't want that huge deficit inflation scenario either. All this adds up to a virtual guarantee that Trump and his allies have no plans to get rid of the IRS or even all income tax. Until the voters start demanding big federal spending cuts and stop saying things like hands off Medicare, the politicians have every incentive to keep the federal spending machine humming at levels far above what tariff revenue is likely to fund.